Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this information session presenting the 2020 Notice of Funding Opportunity for the National Endowment for the Humanities Research and Development Grant Program. My name is Joshua Sternfeld. I'm a Senior Program Officer and Program Coordinator for Research and Development. At the top, I should alert you that at times I will be referring to the program as R&D and the Notice of Funding Opportunity as the NOFO for short. I would like to take a moment to discuss the agenda for this webinar. I will begin by discussing the programmatic objectives for research and development, including the two funding levels that we offer, applicant eligibility, and the types of project teams we typically see with successful applications. Next, I will discuss some of the changes to the program that we have implemented for this year. I will mention some of the areas of special interest, as well as new eligible activities. Following a brief overview of these changes, I will cover a few examples of awards that we have funded in recent years at both levels of funding. I will conclude the webinar by briefly going over the application review process, including the review criteria for R&D, some tips for preparing and submitting your application, and finally, other resources for learning more about this program. I hope to leave some time for you to ask any questions in the chat feature, and I will do my best to address them during the webinar. Research and Development is a grant program that is administered by NEH's Division of Preservation and Access, which is one of the 7 divisions and offices that administers grant programs. R&D supports projects that address major challenges in preserving or providing access to humanities collections and resources. This point is important to stress. While research and development in the humanities can encompass a range of activities and disciplines, the focus of this program must be on humanities collections and resources. We consider this condition broad in terms of the types of collections and materials that you may make the subject of your project, including, but not limited to, audiovisual and time-based media, born digital assets, archaeological artifacts, manuscripts, rare books, artworks, archival records, and an assortment of other materials. The objective of R&D is to support the critical work for developing standards, tools, software, workflows, equipment specifications, metadata schema, data sets, or other products that contribute to improving the preservation of and access to humanities collections. The 2 levels of funding, what we call Tier 1 and Tier 2, are designed to capture as broadly as possible the range of activities undertaken in R&D pursuits. Tier 1 projects may request funding for a period of performance of up to 2 years and $75,000 in outright funds. Tier 1 may support early planning for an advanced implementation project. However, this level can also support other activities, such as basic research, case studies, and discrete experiments, many of which may not endeavor to expand into a larger scale project. Tier 2 projects are for a period of performance of up to 3 years and up to $350,000. Projects in this category should focus on the development of standards, practices, methodologies, and workflows designed to advance the field. We have a submission deadline of May 15, 2020 for all applications. Any U.S. nonprofit organization with 501c3 tax-exempt status, accredited public and 501c3 institutions of higher education, state and local governmental agencies, and federally recognized Native American tribal governments are eligible to apply for research and development. Individuals, along with foreign or for-profit entities, are not eligible to apply. There are a couple of issues that applicants ask us frequently. First, we caution our applicants to avoid including overlapping project costs if you're applying or have already received 2 or more federal funding opportunities for your R&D project. Secondly, we want to encourage eligible U.S. institutions to collaborate internationally. However, it is important to understand that NEH funds may not be used to make subawards to foreign organizations. You may obtain the services of foreign individuals or consultants to carry out programmatic activities on a fee-for-service basis. Of the dozens of grant programs offered by NEH, research and development is perhaps one of only a handful that can support original scientific work. R&D awards have supported chemists, engineers, computer and information scientists, and a host of other types of scientists, practitioners, and scholars. It is truly an interdisciplinary program in the best sense of the term. As such, successful applications tend to have project teams that represent multiple disciplines or fields, which makes sense since, as we shall see, applicants must demonstrate how their projects would benefit the work of the humanities, as well as the work of preservation practitioners. The best applications are often those written by multiple key personnel who represent different domain expertise. We have made a few changes worth highlighting for the 2020 Notice of Funding Opportunity. Foremost, you will find that we have decided to draw attention to 4 areas of special interest. I want to emphasize upfront that if you have a project that does not seem to fit one of these areas, you should still apply. These areas of interest are only intended as a guide for potential applicants, and in no way are intended to privilege certain types of projects over others. As I will discuss later in this webinar, our review process strives to offer a fair and objective review for every application. I think you will find that the areas that we have included in this year's NOFO are intentionally broad in scope, and they generally encompass the entire portfolio of awards that we have made in this program over the last decade or so. The first 2 areas are long-standing interests of our agency. We continue to encourage projects that support work to advance the preservation and access of audiovisual, time-based, and digital materials from the earliest recording formats to the most recent born digital assets. We also continue to have a vested interest in advancing work in conservation science, which we see as fundamental to supporting the essential work of preserving our material heritage. The third category covers the significant work involved with preserving cultural heritage materials that may be imperiled due to armed conflict, war, looting, natural disasters, economic development, poor management, and tourism. This special interest appears in several of our grant programs, and you will find a link to more information about it in our posted NOFO for R&D. I would like to pause a moment on the 4th and final area of special interest, which is brand new to R&D this year, but familiar to our work across the agency. At NEH, we value contributions of underrepresented communities. What that means for R&D is that we encourage projects that pursue the development of standards, methodologies, workflows, and other tools and activities associated with the work of preserving humanities collections for all communities. We understand that for many types of institutions, such as minority-serving institutions, tribal colleges and universities, community colleges, and smaller heritage institutions such as public libraries, historical societies, archives, or museums, achieving the gold standard for preservation may be unrealizable. We would like to see proposals that investigate how to make the work of preserving humanities collections more accessible, sustainable, and manageable for institutions with limited capacities. Over the years, R&D has supported fantastic projects that have tackled issues of preservation and access for persons with disabilities and Indigenous communities, to name just 2 examples. Another change to this year's Notice of Funding Opportunity is the inclusion of a new category in our Tier 1 level, which we are calling Adaptation. We have noticed that projects at all stages of development, from those that have undertaken a planning phase to well-established standards communities, depend upon feedback from an active community to promote adoption, while also making further revisions, upgrades, or other adjustments. Adaptation activities may include any combination of workshops, symposia, forums, documentation, user testing, public demonstrations, online resources, tutorials, or publications to reach targeted audiences. You can imagine Tier 1 adaptation projects like an advanced capstone to a well-developed standard methodology or tool, or an adaptation project may serve as a bridge, connecting one phase to another through the interdependent process of gathering data, iterating, and generating buy-in through strategic community participation. We also encourage applicants to consider using the Tier 1 project to experiment with methods for training a cohort of practitioners that may lead both to focused R&D work, as well as potentially a project in another of our grant programs, preservation, education, and training. Finally, I would like to highlight a new required narrative section we are calling Preservation and Access Research Impact. We hope that this section will alleviate some of the confusion that applicants expressed about the significance to the humanities section. The easiest way to think about the distinction between the two sections is to consider the separate yet complementary sets of audiences that would benefit from your project's outcomes. For the significance to the humanities section, you will want to focus on how your R&D work would benefit the work of the humanities, such as research, educational programming, and/or public programming. You will want to address the overall research problem or challenge that your project will address, while also focusing on the types of collections under consideration. The new Research Impact section should focus on how your project outcomes would benefit preservation practitioners, such as the conservators, archivists, librarians, curators, or other heritage professionals who may gain most directly from the data, methodologies, workflows, tools, or other products developed under your project. I would like to highlight a few examples of recent R&D awards for both levels of funding, starting with Tier 1. In 2016, we supported the University of Pittsburgh in their project titled Sustaining MedArt, the Impact of Socio-Technical Factors on Digital Preservation Strategies. The core of this project was a sustainability case study, examining the challenges posed for preserving a scholarly web resource beloved by medievalists that was at risk of obsolescence. Although the technical requirements to preserving the mid-1990s website are relatively straightforward, what the project team investigated were the complex social contexts, or human infrastructure, surrounding the site's creation, history, and use that required equal consideration. At the conclusion of their project, the team developed what they call a socio-technical sustainability roadmap that leads digital humanities project teams through a process of creating a sustainability plan for their work. Following the completion of their Tier 1 Research and Development Award, the University of Pittsburgh received an award from the Office of Digital Humanities grant program Institute for Advanced Topics in the Digital Humanities to conduct workshops on how to apply the roadmap. I encourage you all to read the white paper for their R&D project posted on our NEH website, which provides a wonderful detailed account of the project and its outcomes. One Tier 2 project that I'm excited to share was made to the Rochester Institute of Technology to develop accessible methods for preserving aural heritage, an area often overlooked in favor of textual and material heritage. A team of audio and software engineers are capturing virtually the acoustic dynamics, or auralizations, of a diverse set of architectural sites, including an historic music studio in Nashville, pictured here with sound capturing equipment, a 1929 bank in Rochester, and the interior of a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Peru. While versions of this technology have been available for years, this project will develop a system that runs readily on readily available equipment and open source software. Researchers will be able to go into the field and create their own auralizations in support of their investigations of different historic performances, such as music concerts or speeches. I highlight this project in part because I believe it exemplifies our newest area of special interest that I mentioned earlier, reaching underrepresented communities. In this case, the open source software and workflows developed by RIT will enable researchers and institutions with limited capacity to conduct aural analyses, which could preserve more imperiled heritage sites while potentially opening the field for new areas of humanistic study. Finally, I would like to share another Tier 2 project from Northwestern University that promises to connect scientific analysis with conservation practice. Using a collection of Georgia O'Keeffe oil paintings in Santa Fe, New Mexico as a test bed, the project proposes to develop an open source tool for characterizing and monitoring the development of metal soap protrusions found, by one scholarly estimate, in 70% of oil paintings. Here we have a wonderful example of an award that typifies interdisciplinarity. A team of curators, conservators, conservation scientists, and digital imaging specialists will collaborate and help ensure that imaging protocols will be accessible to museums that may not have access to sophisticated scientific or imaging equipment. The first stage in NEH's application review process is peer review. A panel of outside experts with relevant knowledge evaluates a group of applications. The reviewers read the applications and make preliminary comments and ratings, then meet to discuss them as a group. I don't have time to cover each review criterion separately, which are mostly self-explanatory. The set of criteria listed here applies to both Tier 1 and Tier 2 projects, and our reviewers typically will read a combination of the two levels on a given panel. I will say that applicants have sometimes overlooked project evaluation and sustainability, which may be expressed differently depending on the context of your proposal. Your discussion of how you or an outside party will evaluate the results of your project can be a key indicator of the viability of your project and the extent to which you will hold yourself accountable for its timely success. Likewise, sustainability is a wide-ranging area that you may want to define according to your project's needs. In some instances, you may want to cover how you propose to make your research data accessible, otherwise known as a data management plan, which is optional. If your project is one of several phases of work, you may want to outline subsequent stages, either in the main narrative or as an optional supplemental appendix. Here are the major components you'll need to create and assemble for your application. A full listing of all materials appears in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Some of the materials are standard forms, but for many of them, you'll prepare a document and ultimately save it as a PDF for uploading into grants.gov. Please follow formatting requirements and naming conventions carefully. Again, most of these items are straightforward, but I would like to point out a few things. Our agency has shifted to using a standard budget form called the Research and Related Budget Form. A separate budget justification is also required that provides requested information about certain budget items listed. You may also use the budget justification to include cost share. Please understand that cost sharing is voluntary and may be used in instances where the total costs exceed the amount awarded by NEH. Cost sharing will not be considered in the evaluation of applications. You will find detailed information in our NOFO explaining how to complete the budget form, but should you have additional questions about the budget, we encourage you to reach out to our colleagues in our Office of Grant Management who can assist you. Something else that is new for this year is that we are requiring applicants to supply a detailed work plan as a separate attachment. In your main narrative, you will want to outline the activities for your project. The attached work plan should be used to provide a more comprehensive timeline. R&D projects are typically very complex, often containing overlapping activities and multiple responsibilities for project personnel. It is important that you explain succinctly how each activity informs subsequent work and how you will coordinate project partners or outside collaborators. The narrative is your opportunity to make the strongest possible case for your project. Don't assume that reviewers know anything about your institution or project beyond what you present in the narrative and application. While it may seem obvious, we cannot emphasize enough that the best narratives are those that adhere to the sections outlined in the NOFO and address all review criteria. Perhaps one of the most difficult challenges for R&D applicants is striking the right balance of technical or scientific language. Your application will be reviewed by a range of readers with varying backgrounds. Many reviewers may be your peers, and so it is important that you demonstrate your knowledge of the field and the most recent research or literature. On the other hand, successful applications are those that can explain the significance of your R&D work for a general educated audience who may be more interested in how your work will have an impact on the work of the humanities. In some instances, if you find your discussion of, say, your project methodology is becoming overly weighed down by jargon, you may want to consider shifting some of your explanation to a strategically included optional appendix. Letters of support are optional, but they can be effective in affirming the impacts that your project will have in the preservation field and the humanities. Applications for NEH grants, like many federal grants, are submitted through a web portal called grants.gov. If you are new to the system, I would recommend spending some time getting familiar with it before you submit your application. Your institution, if it has not done so already, needs to register at least 1 month before applying. We strongly urge that you apply early, as the system can get overwhelmed in the 5 minutes before the midnight deadline. Grants.gov support is available 24/7. All NEH grant applications go through a lengthy review process, which has several stages. The first stage, and what we consider the foundation for our entire review process, is the peer review panel. Evaluators read the applications, write comments, and post a rating. Then they meet to discuss the applications. Following peer review, NEH staff recommends which applications should move forward. Those recommendations are considered by the National Council on the Humanities, 26 people, scholars, and others, nominated by the President and approved by the Senate. The Council makes recommendations to the endowment's chairman, who takes all this into consideration and makes the decision on which applications to fund. It's a long process, but it allows for rich review. After awards are announced, applicants can request the comments from their evaluators. If your proposal is not funded, the reviewer's comments can help you think about how to revise your proposal for next time. We have many general tips and strategies for submitting a competitive application, but I thought I would focus on just a couple here. In the case of R&D, often we receive projects that are overly focused on preserving a specific humanities collection in your institution. Such activities, when not tied to contributing to the broader knowledge of the preservation field, will typically not be competitive, and in some cases may be declared ineligible. We have several programs dedicated to preserving your institutional collections. We would hate for you to put a lot of work into preparing your application only to discover that your project would be better suited for another NEH program. If you have questions about whether R&D is the right program for your project, it is best to reach out to us and speak with a program officer. As I have mentioned before, always keep in mind that the humanities are central to what we do at NEH. It is the primary lens with which we review all grant proposals, even those that are scientifically based, as may be the case for an R&D project. Finally, applicants often get into trouble when they don't plan ahead. You want to make sure that you have enough time to study the guidelines, plan your project, consult with partners, collaborators, and your administration, draft your application, and get feedback from colleagues. I realize that I have presented a lot of information in a compact format. You can find the NOFO along with other useful information such as R&D FAQs and sample successful application narratives on our website, NEH.gov. And you see the web address posted here. If there is nothing else that you can take away from this webinar, it should be that program staff are always available to assist you with questions about preparing and submitting your application. Program officers are available to read drafts submitted to our preservation email account, preservation@neh.gov, no later than April 10th. Even if your draft is not fully developed, this can be a helpful and informative exercise. Thank you for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedules to attend this webinar. I believe we have some time to take a few questions submitted through the chat feature. I will give you a moment to write your questions in the chat function. Oh, I see two questions. One question is, will you make these slides available? We will do our best to actually make this presentation available on our website within the next couple of days. We are recording this webinar now, and we plan to post the webinar recording on our public YouTube channel. Someone has asked, in terms of submitting a draft to program staff, can the proposal draft be simply the narrative section only? This is certainly fine in terms of getting feedback from a program officer. Typically, the narrative is the main section that we will review with you. Occasionally, some applicants will send a budget if they have that prepared, but really, preparing some version or draft of the main narrative is the most important component that you can send to program staff. Someone has asked, can funds be used to purchase social data, for example, Twitter data? That is a very good question. I don't know if there are any regulations one way or another that would prohibit you from purchasing social data. I would say that if this is a key component of your project, it's best to place that question in an email to us, preservation@nih.gov, and that will give us an opportunity to ask the necessary channels to see if there are any anything that would prohibit such a cost in our in your R&D application. It's an interesting question. We haven't encountered that one before. Let's see. Oh, I see other questions. Does it matter if the project has been in existence for several years with no funding? It's not a new project, but has never received a grant. We accept applications for projects at all stages of development. One of the narrative sections that is required for the application is a discussion of your project's history and any previous funding that you may have received. But having funding in previous phases of your project is not a prerequisite. We do recommend that, particularly for tier 2 projects, which are typically at a more advanced stage, that you are able to outline the planning or earlier project phases that went into your project. So that is certainly important. In terms of whether the project has received funding or not, that is not a prerequisite for applying to this program. Someone else has another question about submitting draft proposals. What components should we include in our draft proposals? Well, program staff has received draft proposals at all stages of development, from drafts that are very close to submission to sometimes even a couple of paragraphs. I would recommend, especially considering the April 10th deadline, that you submit as much of the draft that you can prepare for program staff. Even if it's only a couple of pages, program staff typically can provide a lot of feedback. And we do that either through written communication and sometimes oral communication, say by a phone call. So there's no set requirement for what a draft should contain, but really it's a matter of how much you can prepare for program staff in advance. Someone has asked, can you offer any guidance for projects that are grounded in the humanities versus more scientifically based projects, especially in terms of evaluation that will be more qualitative in nature? That's a very good question. And certainly I think, I hope I did not give the impression that we only accept projects that have a science or scientific component to them. I think, for example, in the tier 1 example that I gave from the University of Pittsburgh, that was a project that was much more based with a project team of humanists and preservation practitioners, and had a much stronger qualitative component than a quantitative component. So certainly we see, and this is one of the great things about the R&D program, we see projects in a whole host of types of projects, some that are more heavily represented by humanities scholars and practitioners, and some that have more of a more balanced composition of preservation practitioners, scientists, and scholars. So I hope that my discussion of the interdisciplinarity and the possibility of having science personnel on your project team doesn't dissuade you from submitting a project that may have a majority of humanities scholars or practitioners. Someone has asked, are proposals that focus on K-12 teachers as primary beneficiaries of R&D ever seen as permissible? I would say that that certainly is an audience that we have seen represented in prior projects, and I think that's certainly an audience that can be one of the beneficiaries for an R&D project. Again, if the main focus that you should be aware of is that the project should focus on working with humanities collections and resources. And so if the work that you're conducting for your R&D project is in the context of seeing how to make humanities collections more accessible for, say, a K-12 audience, that can certainly be permissible in this grant program. And it will just be important for you to express how that audience is one of the primary beneficiaries for the outcomes of your project. Someone has reiterated, can the slides be shared on their own for reference? We will do our best to post the slides on our website. I don't know exactly where they will be found, but I will certainly ask our outreach team to share a link to where we post our slides through our Twitter account, and that should and so if you haven't already, you should try to follow our division, and we'll make sure that we get the notice out that that slides have been posted. Someone has asked, is the development of methodologies or technologies that will be made available for other researchers or institutions a condition or foundational requirement? I would say, to a certain extent, it is one of the expectations for this grant program. We see research and development as one of the grant programs that is outward facing, and one that is developing knowledge in all the various types that I went over today, whether it's standards, methodologies, etc., is an outward facing program that makes this knowledge available to as wide an audience as possible. And so it really is one of the areas that we emphasize within the program, and the most successful projects are the ones that make their outcomes as readily available as possible, to the extent that they can. Someone has asked a question about multi-phase R&D projects. Some phases may not be funded or practical yet. Will NEH only fund the immediate next step in a project, or will consider funding later phases when the earlier phases may be self-funded or funded by another agency? I would say it's a little difficult to answer this question without knowing the full context of the state of the project that you may be thinking about. But I will say that I will say this in two ways. One is that, as I indicated earlier, a tier 1 project could be used as an early planning stage for later phases. But even there, we would expect that the project to have actual funded activities as part of the project. NEH does not grant awards for the prospect of a project becoming more developed later in the future. It's solely for projects that have activities that will be undertaken within the period of performance that's indicated in your application. Do you have recommendations or advice on putting together a budget for this program, or typical budgetary mistakes to avoid? That's a very good question. I will say that if you have very specific questions, contacting someone in our Office of Grant Management may be in your interest to talk to, and they can provide much more specific guidance on how to prepare your budget than program staff typically can. I will say, as a general rule of thumb, the more detailed that you can be about your project's budget, and the clearer you are, the easier it is for our staff to be able to go through it and determine that the costs are allowable within this grant program. I will say, I was going to say one other thing about typical budget things. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say is that if you read through our notice of funding opportunity, and this is relatively new for our agency, our guidance on preparing budget is very, very detailed. And so you should see pretty explicit guidance on every category or type of budget item that you may be including within your project's budget. So first things first is I would certainly read carefully the notice of funding opportunity. And again, if you have further questions, we can put you in contact with other colleagues. So you may email us at preservation@neh.gov and we can assist you further. Someone has asked, are similar webinars available for other programs, for example, education and training? That's an excellent question. Thank you for that question. Our notice of funding opportunity for education and training is in the final stages of review and should be posted shortly. I wish I could give you an exact date, but we don't have that one. But I will say, please stay tuned and check regularly on our website for that notice of funding opportunity. And similar to this grant program, as part of our rollout of the program, we will be creating a webinar for education and training. My understanding is the webinar will be pre-recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that, and it should have similar guidance that this webinar does have. Thank you for that question. Someone wrote, I missed the earlier comment about project scope. It seems this grant isn't a good fit for a project that focuses on preserving a specific collection within an institution. Thank you for that question. And yes, that is correct. Just to give you an example, sometimes we receive inquiries or drafts or even applications to, say, digitize a collection of, say, archival records that you may have in your institution. If it's simply a matter of wanting to reformat or better preserve or digitize collections that are in your custody, then we will certainly advise you to consider a number of our other grant programs that are found within our Division of Preservation and Access. It's useful to think about the suite of grant programs that we do provide throughout our division as covering what we hope the entire range of preservation activities, from very general early assessments to much more sophisticated work in digitizing or creating reference resources at a more advanced stage. So the best thing that you can do is, again, to contact a program staff, and we will certainly be able to point you in the most appropriate grant program for the activities that you want to conduct. Someone has asked, what is the difference between this grant opportunity and Humanities Collections and Reference Resources grants? And this is actually a similar question to the question that I just answered. Humanities Collections and Reference Resources is one of our primary grant programs in our division. And it's one of those programs that covers a broad range of activities. It can include things such as indexing or cataloging your collection, again, to later stages of work such as digitization. And so again, if you find that you are much more interested in following standards or practices that are already very well developed in the field, and you simply want funding to complete those activities, then the likelihood is that the grant program Humanities Collections and Reference Resources, or perhaps another one of our grant programs, would be a better fit for your project. This is a good question. Do you recommend that applicants assemble an advisory board beyond main project personnel? This is certainly not a requirement, but some projects have found that having an advisory board is a very useful component to overseeing a project. An advisory board, of course, can carry out any number of functions, from evaluating progress in your project to even participating in certain contexts with the activities that are undertaken in your project. My one recommendation about if you have a question of whether to include an advisory panel or not is that if you do decide to include an advisory board or panel, it's best that you give them that you indicate very explicitly what their roles and functions are in your project. It's one thing to include an advisory board with a number of well-known individuals, but if it's not clear what their role is within the broader project, at times this can be distracting and an indication that perhaps the project is not as well developed as it could be. So I guess the short answer is to say that advisory boards can be very useful if used strategically in the development of your project. Oh, this is a good question. Someone has a question about Tier 1 projects. If applying for a Tier 1 project, should the preservation and access research impact of the narrative section address the impact of the Tier 1 project or the envisioned larger project? That's an excellent question. I think first and foremost, you certainly want to indicate the most immediate impact that you envision for your Tier 1 project. Whether that's, again, discussing the anticipated results from an experiment or any kinds of preliminary documentation or planning that may have been produced as part of your work products for a Tier 1 project. You do want to indicate how those work products may be viewed and potentially even used by other practitioners in the field. Certainly, if you anticipate that your Tier 1 project is a stepping stone towards subsequent phases of your larger project, you do want to, as best you can, indicate what you envision the wider impact of that large project would be to the best that you can in the early stages of your project's development. Someone has wrote, are there cases in which a project is partially funded because some expenses are deemed inappropriate? Or would a project be rejected outright if some budgetary requests are considered inappropriate? I'll take the second question first. I will certainly say that if certain budgetary items are considered inappropriate, that will not declare the entire project ineligible. So rest assured, if a particular budget item or two happens to slip in that is declared ineligible or unallowable for some reason, the project almost assuredly will go through the full review process. In the event that your project is recommended for an award, our Office of Grant Management actually combs very carefully through your project budget, and they will consider any costs that may be deemed unallowable and contact you to perhaps prepare a revised budget or revised work plan based upon those unallowable costs. So short answer is don't worry, a single unallowable cost is not going to declare the entire project ineligible. So I believe that I have reached the end of the hour, and I don't see any other questions here. So I think this is a good opportunity to thank all of you for participating in this webinar. And again, if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact us at preservation@nih.gov. Thank you and have a wonderful day.